In June 2002, every parent's worst nightmare was about to unfold for the Smart family. 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was snatched from her bedroom by a lone intruder. A man who carried out his crimes in the most brazen of ways. A man who threatened violence against a minor. And maybe most importantly, a man who sounded familiar. This is a story of captivity, resilience, and faith. A prime suspect who was already in custody, suspicion falling upon the family, and all the while constant whispers that young Elizabeth could still be out there. So just how was a kidnapping victim held in plain sight? How did her captors manipulate her into coercion? And how did police eventually persuade a victim to reveal their identity? This is the kidnapping of Elizabeth Smart.
Now, before we get into this video, let me just say that we will be discussing themes of kidnapping and abuse pretty much from the start of this video. So just bear that in mind. Whenever we discuss any of these cases, we always remember to be respectful to both the victim and their family. So in whatever we discuss, we will always have that in mind. Now, let's start off the video by going into the Smart family themselves. And the first person we will discuss is Ed Smart. Ed Smart was Elizabeth's dad and a real estate developer. He was also a mortgage broker and a construction contractor, which meant that the family lived in a $1 million mansion in a place called Federal Heights in Salt Lake City in the USA. Now, Federal Heights was a properly safe neighborhood. It was a classic American suburbia, large spread out houses, manicured lawns, and a very, very trusting community. So much so that people didn't even lock their doors. And the Smart family were devoutly religious, following the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as Mormonism. And this meant that the family had a very strict and structured lifestyle. They attended church regularly, they held family prayer at dinner together every single evening at 6 p.m. sharp. And because of their faith, Elizabeth and her 5 siblings lived a very sheltered life. They weren't able to drink, to smoke, to even have coffee, and they certainly weren't allowed to have any extracurricular substances. And this was a big family. Elizabeth's parents, Ed and Lois, had 6 kids, but it wasn't just that. Their extended family often met up and were big parts of each other's lives. Elizabeth's siblings varied from Charles, the eldest, at 16, all the way down to William, who was just 3 years old. And the love and care that these children received was clear in Elizabeth's upbringing. Even as a 14-year-old, a period of time which you might expect some people to be acting out. Now, Joey, you would know this from particular reason.
Nah.
Being a 14-year-old boy, you were definitely acting out at this period, weren't you?
Maybe.
Yes. But she was very, very well behaved, and so much so that she was known pretty much as the angel of the family. I would have to say she was very, very intelligent, very, very good at school. So much so that she was actually playing the harp from the age of 5 years old. And apparently she even practiced for hours every single day. And not only that, she was a very accomplished horse rider and long distance runner. And while Elizabeth's family described her as a very innocent and intelligent young girl, she was also known as being very, very shy, and you would have to get to know her very well for her to open up and talk to you. And that leads us to June the 4th, 2002, a day that felt very similar to every other day in the Smart family household.
Yeah, as it was for Elizabeth, who went about her usual day. She went to school. She actually had an award ceremony at school that day where, surprise, surprise, Elizabeth, knowing how academic she was and how good at these sort of extracurriculum activities she was, she received awards for both academics and for her sporting achievements as well. And after they got back from the school award ceremony, it was pretty much a normal evening for the Smarts. They ate dinner, and Elizabeth actually shared a bedroom with her younger sister Mary Catherine, and the two of them retired to bed around 9 p.m.
Yep.
And it's said, much like you were saying there about Elizabeth having a lot of responsibility from a young age, probably being wise beyond her years, very much so. She actually reads Mary Catherine a bedtime story that night. So she's already, taking that responsibility, helping her parents with brothers and sisters, things like that.
Right, if you're looking to get a bit more done in 2026, we have got something for you. It's Rainbow Dust by Spacegoods. For over 9 months now, we have been drinking this beautiful tasting little drink instead of having a coffee every every morning, and it helps us get energized and keep our focus throughout the day. And if you hit the link below, you can get 20% off any Spacegood order on us. I've got to confess, mate, I do have a little bit of a short attention span.
I think we both do, to be fair. Or did.
And that's because you've been having rainbow dust as well. And in this beautiful tasting drink, you've got ashwagandha, cordyceps, and vitamin B5, which help us calm down, reduce our stress, but also keep our energy and focus. And the worst thing with some of these drinks can be the flavors of them. Sometimes they can taste pretty bad. But the thing is, you literally just have this like a hot chocolate, don't you?
A couple more times than I would have a hot chocolate per day, maybe.
yeah, exactly that. And that's because this comes in various different flavors, including the chocolate that we've just mentioned, which is our favorite. But it also comes in vanilla and cinnamon, coffee, strawberry, and now decaf coffee.
People are raving about the vanilla, by the way. Lots of
People don't say that you're very vanilla, but you love the vanilla and cinnamon. What can you say?
There you go.
And if you want to see what all the fuss is about, why don't you hit the link in the description? And when you're ready to order, you can use code JOEYJOSH for 20% off your order. Big thanks to Spacegoods for sponsoring this episode. Thank you so much to all of you that have supported them. And we know hundreds of you have placed orders now for us. Thank you so much. Now let's get back into the video.
And that's when they do go to bed on the night of June the 4th, as they would any other night, but not long after 4 a.m. on what would now be technically the following day, June the 5th. Mary Catherine walks in to her parents' room and she tells her father, Ed Smart, that Elizabeth is gone. She actually tells him that earlier on in the night, an intruder came into her room and took Elizabeth. And obviously, Ed Smart's initial reaction was probably to think that maybe his young daughter might have had a bad dream. And therefore, he walks into the room to console her and to let her know that there's nothing to worry about. But when he does, he sees that Elizabeth is not in bed. And obviously, that makes Ed panic. He runs downstairs and once again, she's not there. And that's when Ed starts panicking. He's raising his voice. He's turning all the lights in the house on. He's waking everyone up. And when Elizabeth's mother comes to the top of the staircase, she walks down. And Lois Smart then sees that the sheet that's placed in front of the kitchen window has been ripped, confirming that someone has broke into that house. So straight away, they call the police, but while they're waiting for the police to arrive, the first thing they need to do is get as many details out of Mary Catherine as possible.
You can imagine a 9-year-old girl having to explain this to her parents must have been one of the worst things imaginable. You can just actually put yourself in her shoes right now, how traumatic this moment must have been. You described it as a bit of a nightmare that she might have been experiencing. Maybe the dad thought that. I feel like this is a nightmare actually in reality. Like you're actually going through it. So I feel so sorry for her. Even having to be interrogated about this and relive it, it must have been awful.
Yeah, anything that serious for a child, or I think it was 9 years old, Mary Catherine was at the time, and anything that serious just shouldn't be something that even crosses the mind of a child of that age. And I can actually take myself back to being a kid. I remember, like, I used to be well scared of people breaking in and kidnappers and stuff like that. The actual circumstances of this case are directly the sort of things that I think as a kid you're kind of scared of.
Do you know what's crazy as well about
and
this is that the Smart family were also worried about this, so much so that Elizabeth actually accompanied her dad and actually went round making sure all of the windows and the doors that night were actually locked. Did you know that? Like they actually walked around together. This is the thing. So Elizabeth herself was actually concerned about this thing, which makes it even more crazy that it happened this night in particular, because I don't think that was a normal routine either that they went through. So very, very strange. But going back to Mary Catherine, right? She actually shared the bed with Elizabeth. So again, we're talking about the trauma here. You know, they were in direct, very close vicinity to each other. It wasn't like they were on a separate bed and the other side of the room. Like they are literally right next to each other when this happens.
100%. And Mary Catherine was said to be absolutely paralyzed by the fear of things, which again, it just breaks my heart to think about that. But the actual situation which unfolded, obviously, Mary Catherine wakes, and this is what she tells her parents and the police in the aftermath. Mary Catherine actually wakes, and Elizabeth is already awake, and Mary Catherine can hear someone talking to her. So she turns over and sees that there's a man who isn't her dad talking to Elizabeth. Now, obviously, in my opinion, very, very smart at the time of her to do so. She pretends to be asleep. So she lies there, she waits, she pretends to be asleep, but she does take in a lot of what's going on. Now, she believes that the man in the room has a gun, right? She also believes that she hears the man in the room basically threaten Elizabeth's family and say, if you make any noise, I will have to hurt your family and things like that. She also said that she believed that she heard the word ransom mentioned by the perpetrator. Mary Catherine actually said that when Elizabeth eventually was led out of the room by the kidnapper, Elizabeth banged her toe because it was dark, and Elizabeth apparently shouted out because she had stubbed her toe, to which the man told her, "You better keep quiet or I'll have to hurt you." Now, Mary Catherine, as I say, is paralyzed in fear for this time, right? And when she's listening to the sounds of the house, the cracks and the echoes that houses do make in the night, she finally gets to a point where she believes that the man and Elizabeth have now left the house, and therefore she has to do what would have took her so much courage to be able to get up and run into her mum and dad's room to tell them what's happened. She gets to the door of hers and Elizabeth's room. She peers out to run over to her mum and dad's room, and she sees Elizabeth once again with this man still in the hallway of their house. So they weren't really in a massive rush, or the man, I should say, wasn't in a massive rush to be able to get out of the house in time. And at that point, Mary Catherine gets back in bed and lies back down. And it's 2 whole hours she's lied there for in complete fear, absolutely terrified, before she can go in and finally tell her parents what has happened.
Now, a lot of people have questioned this reaction, and anyone that's even questioning this to any degree for even a millisecond doesn't fully understand how you would behave as a child having to go through something as awful as this. Basically, what she had empaths from this moment, what she had understood, is that if there was any noise or any movement or any sort of thing that would have alerted anyone to this potential assailant, that Elizabeth might have been directly harmed. Again, she said that she thought she saw a gun. In other descriptions, it was actually a knife, right? So it could have been any of this thing. It's a weapon, okay, at that point. So she was particularly worried about her sister's safety, but also the potential safety of the rest of her family as well. So again, make noise, make alert. Elizabeth might have been, put to harm, let alone the rest of the family. Something very dangerous could have happened. And again, she didn't quite understand where the assailant was at this time, which is why she waited for that period of time. She didn't know whether he was in the house. And also, key fact here, there was an alarm on one of the doors, and the alarm would go off if you opened the door and left. Now, interestingly, this was the door that the assailant eventually leaves out of, and the alarm didn't go off. So this is why this young girl, bless her heart, she stays in bed, because she thinks he might still be in the house even that period of time after. She gets the courage to be able to get out of bed, and then, as Joey says, she then goes and speaks to her family, and this is where everything goes crazy from this point on.
Yeah, and we won't give away too much of what's to come in the case, but actually, in hindsight, I think you could definitely credit Mary Catherine's actions that night as one of the big factors of how this case would actually eventually play out, which, listen, no spoilers here, but isn't the usual way that we see in these types of cases. But once the police arrive, Mary Catherine drops a bombshell. She tells detectives that she recognized the voice that was inside her bedroom. And once again, the admission of feeling like she knew that voice that night was something that would have a monumental effect on the way that this case was handled. However, speaking about the handling of the case, when the police arrive at the Smarts household, they see that there's nothing to suggest that Elizabeth was taken in a vehicle or that she was transported in any way other than on foot. So instead of treating the house as if you would for a usual crime scene, they actually start immediately looking for Elizabeth, believing that she could still be within the vicinity.
And this is a key point, actually, because in these cases, forensic evidence is very, very important, and it's very important to try and hermetically seal certain parts of households to make sure that they can preserve as much evidence as possible. Now, this is not necessarily what happened in this case. Obviously, obviously everyone is incredibly panicked and they are searching throughout the house straight away. Both the family but also the police are looking in every element of the house. They're trying to find out what could have happened. They're trying to see if she's actually just hiding in the general area, might have just wandered outside. They're looking all over the place. But what that meant is that the crime scene actually had some contamination as part of it, and they weren't able to get all of the DNA and forensic evidence in the same way that they would do in other similar cases like this. And we've seen this in other missing persons cases. If you don't get that very early, it's gone, and it basically is never able to be found ever again. But it wasn't just that in terms of the, I suppose, the searching and the forensic and the evidence they were looking at. Didn't they also get like bloodhounds that were actually trying to search for her? Basically, from the very get-go, they were trying to pick up a scent, weren't they?
Yeah, so that was one of the things that the crime scene basically told detectives straight away, which, listen, doesn't mean that there's no way that this outcome could be wrong, or there's no way that it could have been manipulated in some kind of way. But the initial crime scene was telling them that someone had definitely taken Elizabeth out of the house. It wasn't telling them that Elizabeth had come to harm within that house. They were blood dogs that were used. So like we've discussed, cadaver dogs in cases before that smell for the scent of dead bodies, rotting corpses, stuff like that. Cadaver dogs will obviously smell for the scent of someone's blood, but also you could give a cadaver, a certain type of cadaver dog, a certain type of blood dog, a bit of clothing, and they could also smell for that scent. Now, they track Elizabeth's scent. They track Elizabeth's scent from the window, which we all believed that she was taken out of, all the way to the gate of the back garden, but just a matter of feet from her back garden heading up in towards the mountains, they lose the track.
I've never been able to understood that, because I thought these blood dogs were really, really good at harnessing a scent and following it, and everything that I've ever seen, they're really good at doing it. So this person is either a criminal genius or just something really strange has happened in this moment. Do you know what I mean?
100%. I think, again, I would lean towards the latter, but I think we'll only probably make our assumptions up on that as we learn a little bit more out about the case. But regardless, that first evening, I think as much as with all sort of true crime cases, we're always going to analyze things and ask the question of, could this have been done better? And if that had have been done better, could we have had a quicker resolution in this case? Although we do that, one thing I want to make very, very clear is the response that night was definitely that of a police force that were looking for Elizabeth Smart. They did put in the groundwork. They did look up in the mountains, even once the cadaver dogs had dropped that scent. And there were a lot of people out that night looking for Elizabeth Smart. But despite their best efforts, in which police officers were exhausted, covering plenty of grounds in, let's be honest, very difficult environments, to be honest, when we're talking about mountains and the terrain that come with that, the immediate searches were ultimately unsuccessful. And by sunrise, Salt Lake City would be starting to hear reports of a missing girl.
And before they do, the police are still talking to Mary Catherine and trying to find out as much information as they could at this point. Now, she's actually still speaking to police and she's trying to piece together her memories. Again, just waking up, it would be incredibly difficult to do so, but she does get some more information out at this point. She says that yes, the man was potentially armed. She says that he was approximately 5'6" tall, and she was able to actually say what the assailant was actually wearing, in that it was sort of light coloured clothing and a light, what she described as a golf cap. And again, as we have said, she did carry on saying that she very much recognized the voice, and she wouldn't drop that point even after the police were going, are you sure you could have made a mistake? She was like, no, I recognize the voice. But clearly, still at this point, she was unable to say who that voice belonged to. And now outside of the home, this was becoming national news. This was the biggest missing person case in American history up to this point. It was absolutely massive. So much so that the public's reaction from this was unprecedented in American history. It started off with about 250 people volunteering at 10:30 a.m. that day, the day that she actually went missing, to actually help try and find her. A couple of hours later, that was 2,000 people. By the end of the day, it was 8,000 people from the local community that turned up and said that they wanted to help find her. And you can understand why. A young girl, completely innocent, kidnapped from her own bedroom. This story hit home, and it hit home in a very significant way. And as Joey said, it wasn't just the local community that were out helping, it was also the police. So much so that there were 33 different fixed aircraft, 7 helicopters, and over 150 ATVs involved in the search almost straight away. And then Ed Smart, Elizabeth's father, makes a very heartfelt plea on television, trying his best to help identify and find his daughter.
I want to thank you all for your help. I can't thank you enough. I know it's going to take everyone's effort to find her.
It's really hard to think of somebody coming in there and taking her.
I would do anything to have her back in my arms.
And in fact, a horrible part of this case, Ed was so sort of panicked and devastated and stressed about this. He actually was hospitalized very soon after Elizabeth goes missing. Now, thankfully, he made a recovery, but you can see the toll that it was taking, not just on the family, but their own health as well. But there was something much more sinister happening behind the scenes at this point. The police interrogators and the police sort of investigators were hearing something ringing in their ears, and it was Mary Catherine's point that she had said she recognized that voice. So what the police did is they went down a very well-trodden path that they often do in these cases, and they looked directly at the family. Again, Mary Catherine was able to identify that it was a male voice, and so the police started going down male potential suspects, and they started with the direct family. And remember what I just told you about Ed Smart, about how devastated he was, the fact that he was hospitalized? Well, they got Ed Smart in and they interrogated him, the police, for over 8 hours. He had to do polygraph tests. They asked him every question under the sun. You can imagine a grieving father trying his best to keep it together, and the police were there interrogating him. I have to say, I couldn't believe that when I heard about this case.
Is it unbelievable?
Why? Why'd you say that?
I could come in for a bit of stick here, Josh, yeah? But we research true crime cases so often. Would you say way more often than not, the offence is usually committed by someone that the victim knew?
100%. That is a trope that we see all the time in those cases. Fair enough.
That's a trope we see very often.
Yep.
Now, again, this is just circumstantial bits. This is almost on a gut feeling, right? Personally, if I was a police officer and I turned up to a crime scene and the dad said to me, yeah, the girl that's gone missing, she actually went round and locked every window inside this house tonight. Personally, I'm thinking that's a bit weird. I'm thinking bit of an overreach, isn't it? By the way, I would have been wrong here. Clearly, I'm just saying how someone can perceive things. Personally, I think that's a little bit weird. The second the daughter, Mary Catherine, is saying she recognises the voice, there's enough there at that point, with the bits of evidence I've given you, there's enough there to, for the sake of being able to at least rule the parents out, rule the family members out, there's enough there to question them. If I am Ed Smart, the second I understand that the police have potentially turned attention to me, do you know what I'm going to do?
What?
I am going to comply with every fucking thing they want me to do. And I'm also not going to sit and complain about it, Josh. And do you know why I'm going to do that? Because by me doing that, by me complying, they're going to realise how innocent I am 10 times quicker than had I have not complied, had I have not sat and done a lie detector and done all this questioning, whether or not I'm in a good state. Because that means that they're going to be put back on the track to find whoever's potentially responsible 10 times quicker, in my opinion, than they would be had they have not questioned the family. So all I'm saying here is this. I saw a lot of debate and controversy over the fact of them questioning the family and looking into the family and whether or not they were wasting their time. I think ultimately, at the end of the story, we'll have our answer to that. But at this point in the case, I think anyone who personally doesn't think that the family of Elizabeth Smart should be questioned probably hasn't done a deep dive into true crime cases, because more often than not, that questioning could probably yield answer.
So 2 points to come off the back of that before we go into the rest of the other interrogations that happened, and there were significantly other interrogations at this point. The 2 points that I'll say is, if you are innocent and you know you're innocent, you always get very annoyed when people accuse you. That's just human nature.
Very much so, yeah.
So I completely understand that. And the behaviour of the police in the rest of this case might indicate that they might not, the family, be that happy with the way that they treated them in general, right? So that's the first thing I would say. And the second point is, just go with me for a second. I want you to close your eyes, right? Imagine this. Your uncle says something to you with your eyes closed. Do you think you could identify his voice? Bearing in mind you've grown up with him your entire life. You've known him from the moment you were born. do you not think you could identify his voice with your eyes closed?
Within a second.
So my point back on that is, if Mary Catherine is going, I recognise the voice, but I can't tell you who it is, that for me almost directly rules out the family. I feel like she would have been able to recognise the voice, and I feel like she would have said, if that was my uncle, that's my uncle. I feel like she would have been able to identify that. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Let alone my father, which would have been a whole different thing.
And the thing is, I think that as the case goes on and as we reveal more to the viewers, they'll see that there was a lot that the police did here, or didn't do, that we should say, that showed that they were incompetent in a lot of areas. It's just my personal feeling, I do feel quite strongly about it, that if I'm in that situation, as much as no one would want to be in that situation, and people might feel aggrieved at the fact that someone could be suggesting they're involved in something that they're clearly not, at the same time as that, whatever draws them to the conclusion that it wasn't me quick enough is the route I'm going to go down.
That's fair enough. Right. So let's get into it now then. They also interrogated all of the uncles and male members of the family outside of the direct close-knit as well. And interestingly, Tom Smart, one of the uncles, actually failed a polygraph test, which definitely arised a lot of suspicion under him at the time.
One of the things why it did raise suspicion as well was the fact that Tom Smart was very, very hands-on in this case and investigation. Some would argue maybe more hands-on, probably just because of the character and personality type, than even Ed Smart, Elizabeth's dad. I'm not suggesting that that's a fact, but some would make that argument.
Yeah.
Tom Smart fails the polygraph.
Yeah, it's proper wrong, isn't it? And you know what? I understand why police, especially when they're in a high pressure situation, they're trying to find suspects as quickly as possible. To fail a polygraph test, which, caveat to this now, Joey, we've done a lot of these true crime videos. We know how unregulated and how unfair polygraph tests actually are.
Yep.
In fact, they're very often correct. Right? So you've always got to have the caveat in your mind. But what was if I also told you that the police also interrogated and polygraphed Elizabeth's brothers? They were only 16 and 11 at the time, and they got them involved and questioned them as if they were suspects, not as if they were victims or potential witnesses of this crime. They were looking at the male members of the family, and they actually did that. So again, all in all, right, you can understand why they did this line of questioning, you can understand why they spoke to them, but you also then have to say, if they aren't related to them and there isn't any connection, then this is a big waste of time, and they've also let a potential suspect that is still out there at large get away even further than what they might have had been before this. And I have to say, what annoyed me the most about this period of time is that these polygraph results by the uncles and the family actually got leaked to the media, which meant there was even more speculation on the family, completely unfairly, and they got a lot of heat as a result of that, which again, looking back on this now, is just a complete and utter joke, complete waste of time. And they've, again, missing out on the actual potential suspects.
Unfortunately, it wouldn't be the first time in this case that a media leak had the public feeling like they knew who was responsible for Elizabeth's disappearance.
So much so that there was actually 16,000 tip-offs that the public had given. And so the police had various different suspects, all the way looking at potential sexual offenders, all the way to white-collar extortionists, even biker gangs they were looking into. They were going into every potential lead they possibly could. But you can imagine the sheer level of it would be very, very difficult to do. But I do have to give the police some credit at this period of time, because they did do some really good police work at this point. They understood that various people had been in and around the Smart household around this time, both working on renovation jobs. There were people looking at skylights. There were people that were doing renovations outside, landscaping. There were people doing odd jobs. There were people doing various different things around the house. And so they drew up a little bit of a short list and then tried to identify different criminalities that could have been connected with this short list. And very soon after doing that, they discovered what they felt was their prime suspect, and his name was Richard Ricci. And guess what? This guy was a handyman who had been to the house several times as he was painting up the place. He was doing landscaping work. He even did some carpentry inside the house, which meant he became the most credible lead that they'd looked into to date. And then when they looked into his record, it became very, very sinister indeed. Basically, Richard Ricci was a complete career criminal. He had tried to kill a police officer, but perhaps most relevant here, he was known to be a burglar, working at nighttime, breaking into people's homes, and all while they were sleeping. And not only had he worked at the Smarts home, but he actually had a record of stealing from the Smarts home. He actually stole a pearl necklace that belonged to Elizabeth's mother, Lois. And he actually was fired from his job at the family home for doing this. And so the police start working this guy. They're interrogating him, but also all the while trying to gather as much evidence as they possibly can. Inside Ricci's father-in-law's house, they found a white colour golf cap and a machete, items that they said matched Mary Catherine's description of the assailant. And they also couldn't pin down an alibi for him at this time, or so they said, mainly because Ricci's wife Angela couldn't state exactly where he was. But when they finally get Richard in, he was adamant that he had nothing to do with the abduction, so much so that he broke down, he started crying, and eventually he became irate at the police. And so they keep him in jail, they keep interrogating him, and 2 months after he was initially questioned, Richard became very unwell indeed. He actually suffered from an aneurysm. So bad was this condition that he actually died on August the 30th, 2002. And police very much felt that the case might have died with him. And they were so suspicious that they didn't even let Richard's wife Angela actually even hug his body after he passed away. However, this wasn't the end of the story, because soon after that, people still reported potential sightings of what they thought might have been Elizabeth. And so, for the Smart family, there was still hope.
This has got to be one of the things that I feel makes the case so unique. So unique. And that's the fact that we've obviously discussed kidnappings before. We've discussed missing persons cases. We discussed Ariel Castro, a man who kidnapped 3 women and had them in his house for the best part of a decade. And in all of these cases we've looked into, there's never been sightings. There might have been 1 or 2 unconfirmed, or I think I've seen Madeleine McCann in Belgium. But what people need to understand about this case is during the disappearance, during the time that Elizabeth Smart is missing, I understand she's a young blonde-haired girl. Many young blonde-haired girls might look the same. But the level of sightings that were being reported were unlike anything in a missing persons case.
Yeah, you can imagine this. There was few of them that were obviously not true and there were false sightings, but there was a lot of very credible leads that the police basically jumped on.
There were a lot of patterns developing. Patterns of maybe certain outfits that people that were being sighted were wearing, certain behaviours, or even certain people that they were with. And these sightings did not stop when Richard Ricci passed away.
And this is where the police get a report of a potential sighting at a party. This man called Ron Lewis calls the police up and says that he thinks he might have seen Elizabeth. In fact, he saw 2 women dressed very strangely at this party, and he could have sworn that he recognised her face.
And Ron Lewis does report that sighting to the police, but I don't think that all that much was done about it, or that it was potentially even taken all that seriously. And that meant that by October 2002, 4 months had now gone by, and the Smart family was still in limbo. The chief suspect in the case, in Richard Ricci, has now passed away, and before passing away, he was completely denying any involvement in the case. I understand the possessions from the Smart family household were found amongst his possessions, but at the same time as that, if you look at Richard Ricci's criminal record, I'm not saying he's not capable of doing this crime, but if he was, it would be the first time that he had done anything like this. And therefore the family don't really feel like any progress has been made. And as much as they are still getting these odd sightings in and around the Salt Lake City area, things aren't looking good. And that's when the only actual witness to the crime, in Mary Catherine, has somewhat of an epiphany. She's sitting down, she's actually reading the Guinness World Record books, right? And there's a photo in that book that for some reason jogs her memory and unlocks her memory from that night. Mary Catherine looks up from that Guinness World Records book. She looks at her father, Ed Smart, and she says, "Dad, I think I know who it was." it was Emmanuel.
Now, the name Emmanuel didn't directly remind Ed of anyone in particular, did it? Like, he didn't remember the name.
No, it wasn't a clear and obvious thing of when he said that name, there was a light bulb moment. There was actually a little bit of confusion for a while where Ed Smart tried to wonder whether or not his daughter had got the name wrong or whether or not there was someone he had forgotten. There was someone that he had forgot. He remembers that around a year earlier, he had given some, what we in the UK call handyman work, basically. Work that you don't really need to be a qualified tradesman to carry out. It could be a leak that needs fixing. It could be some tiles that have fallen off a roof. And this sort of work was something that Ed Smart, not just in this one circumstance, but actually in many circumstances, had done. He was obviously a man of faith, and he would see other people that were people of faith, but were fallen on harder times, were homeless in some circumstances. He had actually given work to a man called Emmanuel on his house around a year prior. However, this wasn't actually something that was all that out of the ordinary. What was out of the ordinary was the fact that this man, Emmanuel, had only ever done 1 day's work on the Smart household. A day's work in which Ed didn't know whether he had any contact with Elizabeth, Mary Catherine, or any of the other children. So although it felt unlikely, Ed Smart knew that he had to act, and that's exactly what he does. Straight away, he calls the police and he tells them, we think we know who it was. And before Ed can even get to the police station, he gets a sketch drawn up of Emmanuel. He takes that sketch to the police and they're not interested. The police are still fixated on Richard Ricci, despite the fact that he's now passed away and despite the fact he denied any involvement. And the police also felt like the Emmanuel lead didn't hold all that much weight. They were doubtful whether Mary Catherine, at the age she was at, would be able to remember the voice of a man after a year who she hadn't ever really spoken in any great detail with. Not only that, the sketch had some distinct differences to the initial statement and description that was given by Mary Catherine, who is a child, let's remember. And some of the most skeptical police officers even believed that this could have been some kind of sick ploy by Elizabeth Smart's family as an attempt to keep her name in the media because they had noticed that less and less stories were being run on the missing girl. And this meant that the Smarts spent the best part of 4 whole months arguing with the police over the sketch, arguing with the police over whether the sketch should be put out to the public. And that is 4 whole months in which Elizabeth was still missing, in which there was still hope that Elizabeth was out there, in which reports of Elizabeth were still being filed to police. And usually this is the point in a story where we tell you that the police came to their senses and eventually tried to make it right. But they didn't. Because the Smarts eventually had to bypass the police and they had to take the sketch onto the TV show America's Most Wanted in February 2003. And once they did, the phone calls started flooding in. But it was 3 separate calls that would actually catch the police's attention, and these were 3 specific witnesses who all claimed to have known the man from the sketch. They claimed that that man was their stepfather, and that man was named Brian David Mitchell.
Brian David Mitchell was born in 1953 and he was raised in a very religious Mormon household. His childhood, though, was incredibly troubled, so much so that he was known from a very young age as having an obsession with adult material. And he had a criminal record very early on in his life as well, as he had exposed himself to a child. And by the time he was just a teenager, he had a history of both alcohol and substance abuse. And it got so bad that he was actually excommunicated from the Mormon church because of his religious beliefs and also his lifestyle. And these religious beliefs were called extreme because effectively he saw himself as a bit of a prophet destined to battle what he described as the Antichrist. And he actually wrote a manifesto of sorts called the Book of Emmanuel David Isaiah to try and justify his own actions. He believed in polygamy and he definitely wanted power over women that he was close to. And speaking of those women, let's now introduce his wife, called Wanda Barzee. She met Mitchell in a support group and married him in 1985. Wanda grew up as a decently well-off young woman, actually, and practiced the Mormon faith and integrated very well within her own community. But after meeting Mitchell, her life would change very quickly and very significantly. She was later diagnosed with dependent personality disorder and shared Mitchell's delusional belief systems. So now that we've identified the abductors, why don't we actually explain what actually happened to Elizabeth? After taking Elizabeth from her bedroom at knife point, Mitchell led her out the kitchen door and through the backyard as they crossed the street near her home. And in a very strange turn of events, when he crossed the road with Elizabeth, there was a police car directly in front of them. The police car then slowly moved off. So close were they to actually identifying someone in the act of kidnapping, it was unimaginable, but the police car then drove away. He then pushed Elizabeth into a bush and they started a very long walk up the mountainside behind her home. And this was not an easy hike at all. It was 3 to 4 miles up a mountain trail into Dry Creek Canyon to a concealed campsite, and that night Mitchell performed a marriage ceremony claiming that this 14-year-old girl was now his wife. And immediately after this ceremony, Mitchell then assaulted Elizabeth, and he did so almost every day of her captivity. To prevent escape, Mitchell tethered Elizabeth to a tree using a steel cable locked around her ankle, and he wore the key to that lock around his neck. Mitchell then renamed Elizabeth, basically a name that was a biblical name, and he actually said to her that she could create her own sort of alias as well, and she named herself Esther. And from that point on, Mitchell actually brazenly took Elizabeth out, so much so that there were actually several sightings and several very close calls to actually finding her and identifying her, but some that were never actually followed up on.
You know how you say brazenly there in the way that he would take her into public? I think you're definitely right in terms of that's how we all perceive it. We cannot fathom the fact that you would commit that sort of crime and then be exactly what you said in terms of so brazen to then actually have the confidence you could take that girl out in public and she's not going to run away. She's not going to dog you in. She's not going to tell someone that you are actually her capture and not her guardian. The reason I say it might not have been as brazen as we say it is, and this is like the tragic part of the case, one of many tragic parts, is the fact that the conditioning process that Elizabeth Smart would have been put through in that time actually, in my opinion, means that he probably wasn't being all that brazen, because if you had experienced what Elizabeth Smart did during her captivity, I think that most people in that situation would probably feel like they've got a lot of control over that person that Brian David Mitchell clearly felt like he had over Elizabeth Smart. So I actually think that when he did go into town or out in the public, I don't think Brian David Mitchell was massively concerned that Elizabeth was going to run away.
No, 100%. And this is the context that we haven't really gone into. And I've kind of done that intentionally, right? Because I don't want to detail every single thing that he did. Because I think if we did, it would be incredibly traumatic to her and unfair, really, on her, right? But as Joey says, he was often holding her at knife point. He often said to her that he would harm and potentially murder her entire family if she ever tried to escape or did anything improper. And he also actually controlled her eating, her drinking. He controlled every element, and we mean that literally, every element of her life while in captivity. So again, people often struggle to understand the Stockholm syndrome or even the conditioning that sometimes kidnappers can do on their victims. And we've described this in various videos that you've already gone into so far. But you could completely understand in this situation how she was conditioned and so fearful for her own and family's lives that she wouldn't do anything too sort of crazy and try and escape, when we feel that there were various opportunities to escape or to stop the situation from getting as far as it did.
And in my opinion, it shows that Elizabeth Smart was able to keep that part of her identity about her, that she still had that moral compass, she still had those values, and they were very much family at the core of everything, to the point where this poor young teenage girl has been kidnapped and her first instinct is still to protect her family. That's what she felt like she was doing during her captivity.
Yeah, 100%. And this started from the very moment in which she was kidnapped. Basically, you know, you can imagine she sat next to her sister in the same bed. If she had cried out, potentially she could have stopped the whole process. Potentially she could have helped her entire family. Potentially this whole thing might not have happened. But what happens if it didn't? What happens if he, you know, held the knife a little bit too closely? What happens if he slit her throat? What happens if he then harmed the sister? And let's go into the worst case scenario. You can imagine then what might have potentially happened to the rest of the family with an assailant in the home at this time. It could have been absolutely devastating. We could have been talking about an awful case right now. But let me get back to the sightings, because I said that there were several sightings and several very close calls. And when I say close calls, I mean incredibly close calls. On the night that she actually went missing, there was a search party very close to the campsite, and Elizabeth actually hears her name being called out, and it was actually one of her uncles that was very, very close to the campsite in which she was on that night being taken captive. And basically Mitchell at this point says, if you scream, if you say anything, I'm going to slit your throat right now on this moment. And it started from that point on, didn't it? But that wasn't the only close call. Actually, during the summer and autumn of 2002, Mitchell would take Elizabeth out, as we said, several times to Salt Lake City, which is a massive city in the US. But the key thing is that he described her in full robes and also both a veil that covered her hair, which was very distinctive, blonde hair. You'd see that from a mile away, wouldn't you, as well? But also a veil over her face and eyes. So again, it was very difficult to actually identify her when she was out and about with Mitchell.
She didn't have blonde hair, mate.
What colour hair did she have?
Augustine was a 14-year-old girl
with
who, for
grey
some
hair.
reason, had grey hair.
The
She
disguises.
had a grey wig on.
Yeah, very strange. And if you actually identified that wig, if you were able to actually see it properly, you would go, that's just wrong.
No.
Like if you were able to actually see behind that veil, you'd see it was a wig pretty quickly, wouldn't you? But that's the thing with the veil and the disguise that she was wearing. It was very difficult to actually ascertain who she was. And then there was the party that we also mentioned. There was that sighting there. That party got so significant and so serious that Mitchell was drinking absinthe. He got completely drunk. He was completely obnoxious. He was chatting a load of rubbish, and he actually got thrown out of that party. So you can actually understand why there was potential sightings and why people remembered this group of 3 people because of the way he was behaving again. But the fact that this didn't come to anything, this potential party sighting, did you know there was actually photographs of her at the party as well, which I find crazy. And again, we'll show photos here. It's just insane to me that this has come out after that we've got this photographic proof, and yet she wasn't found at this point. It's just crazy. So then there was another sighting. A homicide cop actually spoke to Mitchell inside a public library and had a full-on conversation about who he was and what he was doing. Basically, there was reports within the library of someone acting strangely, not fitting the bill of someone that should necessarily be there, and basically having 2 women around him in very unusual circumstances. So the homicide cop goes up to Mitchell and has a conversation with him. He says, what are you doing here? Why are people thinking that you're suspicious? And what really are your intentions? Like, what are you doing? And he goes, you know, I'm just practicing my faith. I'm preaching. I'm allowed to be in this area. It's a very normal thing. And he's very manipulative and very good at convincing people of his own beliefs. And again, he hid behind his own religious beliefs at this point. He said, there's no way that you can talk to my wife and partner, and there's definitely no reason you can talk to my daughter. And you might be going, what is he talking about, his daughter? He said that Elizabeth was his daughter. He said that she was called Augustine, and again he said that they were related, that she was a young girl, and there's nothing that the police could do in terms of speaking to her. It would be incredibly insensitive if he did.
I think that there was something along the lines of I don't know, because I don't know the exact religion that they were tying themselves to, but there was something along the lines of a vow of silence that came from their faith.
Yeah,
I think that's what he was alluding to the police officers. And I can, listen, this was a different time. This is over 20 years ago, but I can imagine that if I was a police officer, it might be a little bit of a sensitive subject. I'm not saying you'd bypass the law and what you think's right or wrong, but if that person was to give you enough that you felt, okay, they've been compliant, they've answered questions and things like that, I can see why it could be a bit of a deterrent to sort of to question someone too much on their beliefs and stuff like that.
This is the thing. The homicide cop actually said that they would convert, like temporarily. They would say, "I'll convert to your faith if it means that I can understand what's going on here." And again, Mitchell at this point made it very clear you cannot convert. Even if you did convert, it would be incredibly disrespectful to me if you interrogated these women.
Strange behaviour, but not non-compliant.
No,
that's the key thing, though, isn't it? He's not complying there. He's not saying, I'm not telling you why. No. He's saying, this is why. I'll tell you why.
And you're going to offend my religious beliefs. And again, in this, part of the country in America, Christianity and their own religious sects, like, again, that's very well respected. Yep. And people wouldn't really mess with that. And so the cop didn't at this point. So again, police right there, almost being able to solve the entire case and not able to actually do it. So that wasn't the last sighting. There was also another one in September 2002 when basically the trio decided to travel from what is a very cold climate in Salt Lake City and that sort of general area in Utah to warmer climes. You can imagine they're living in a campsite. They are very much not prepared for winter. So they would have had to go to warmer climes. They actually stopped living in the campsite, moved slightly down the mountain, and then decided to go to California. And they decided to go basically in the San Diego area. And at various times during this period, Elizabeth was then also out in the San Diego area, suburbs all around it. And again, she was never actually formally identified. And on February the 12th, 2003, Mitchell actually broke into a church in Lakeside, California. He decided he was going to steal some items. And he's such an awful criminal. At this point, he actually got drunk and passed out inside of the church, got arrested, and then said to police that his name was Michael Jensen. Mitchell actually appeared before a judge, pleaded guilty to vandalism and trespassing, and was released a few days after. The authorities did not realize at this time that he was a wanted kidnapper from Utah. They literally had him in custody. But in March 2003, Elizabeth was actually the one to try and convince Mitchell to return back to Utah. She did this by saying that she actually received a revelation that they should go back. And this was the best thing that she could have done, because when they returned back to Utah, someone actually recognizes her.
Yeah, so as Josh said, Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee were hardly staying in one area at this moment in time. And that was actually around the exact same sort of time that the sketch that was drawn up and that was refused to be put out to the public by police was actually pushed through and put out to the public. And this was because Ed Smart and Elizabeth Smart's family had decided to go against the advice of the police. And they did put out this sketch to the public. And I actually have a feeling, a slight suspicion, that Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee may well have known that they had been featured on America's Most Wanted, because when you actually look into the registered sightings of Elizabeth Smart sightings were coming in nearly every other day around this time. And after the feature on America's Most Wanted, it would actually be a matter of weeks before any sightings would come in, which does lead me to believe that when you look at the prior behaviour, I think Brian David Mitchell got a sniff that this case was being featured on national TV. And by March the 12th, 2003, two separate couples call the police to tell them that they have just seen what they believe is a father and a mother with Elizabeth Smart. And when officers question those that are calling in, they find out that there are 3 individuals wandering around the Utah area. 2 of those women and 1 of those a male, who apparently is going around and speaking about religion. He's preaching and he's actually trying to raise money. The 2 women, however, are veiled and they're not allowed to talk. And when a member of the public asks them why they're not allowed to talk, Brian David Mitchell jumps in and says to protect their honesty. And eventually the police arrive, they approach the 3, they ask them their names, to which Brian David Mitchell responds, Peter, Juliet, and Augustine Marshall. The problem was, as I already said, the girl very clearly had a disguise on. The police weren't buying that there was a 14-year-old that already had grey hair. They didn't know why she needed to wear the sunglasses that she had on. And when the girl took off her sunglasses, before a police officer can even say anything to her, she says to the police officer, I think I know who you think I am. but I'm not that girl. The girl she was talking about was Elizabeth Smart. And the police officer in question can't believe his eyes. He can't believe his ears. He can't believe what this girl in front of him is telling him, to the point that he has to hold up the missing person poster to her face and say, Elizabeth, this is you. And despite being massively reluctant to do so, once getting in the back of the police car, Elizabeth Smart confesses, and she tells the police that it is them. One of the craziest things here is Elizabeth Smart's first instinct is to ask whether Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee were in trouble and whether they were going to be all right. But as Elizabeth Smart's captivity was ending, theirs was just beginning, because Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee are arrested and taken to jail. And that's when Ed Smart gets a call that I'm sure he'd have been very, very hopeful of. But at this point, 9 months on, probably a call that he was beginning to realise that he may never get. And that was a call that not only confirmed to him that Elizabeth had been found in the most unlikely of scenarios. Elizabeth Smart was still alive. So Ed Smart rushes to the police station for a moment he has been longing for. But when he gets there, Elizabeth Smart is somewhat disgruntled at that moment in time. Some would say she hasn't really been treated all that well.
No, basically what Elizabeth had said after the fact here is that she actually was initially handcuffed and she thought she might have been under arrest. And also she had said that she'd never really had any interactions with police up until this point. And so she was a little bit scared just generally to have any conversations with police. She didn't really know how to behave, deer in the headlights kind of scenario. So she is handcuffed, put in the back of the police car. The police obviously just saying like, everything's okay, just make, you know, I hope you're all right, but we're going to take you to somewhere safe. And so she gets taken to the police station. She gets put in a very small room. She thought it was a prison cell. Again, no interaction with the police. She wouldn't even know what a cell even looked like. She gets put in there. She's left by herself for a period of time. And then the door opens. Her dad comes in. He grabs her, hugs her like I can only imagine, you know, a man in this situation would hug her, breaks down in fits of tears. You can imagine the elation that this man would have. But it's only when he steps back and she can sort of take a bit of time and truly understand what's happened and actually recognizes her father. She sees it's him, and it's that moment in which she actually fully comprehends that she's safe. She's no longer in this situation and she is with her family. And ultimately, it was only when she was with her family that she truly felt that she was free and able to live her life again.
And it was that day that we actually got a bit of media that now will forever go down in the history books. Ed Smart, he walks out of the police station that day, and it's quite a heartwarming moment actually, because usually, you know, I think people will see the media as a nuisance in many ways, and I'm not disputing that they can be, but this moment here, you see Ed Smart doesn't really want to walk over to the media, and they're so happy for him that Elizabeth's been found. And obviously the media had been used by the Smart family for, you know, for sort of positive elements of the case when they needed to rely on the media and fall on them, maybe when the police weren't doing their job as well. So Ed Smart eventually gives a little thumbs up to the media there, and it was a very, very wholesome moment in such a tragic case.
And this is the thing, like the media is a double-edged sword, isn't it? Like sometimes it could be your best friends and sometimes it could be your worst enemies, and we saw that in this case really in terms of the way that it actually ran. But yeah, that was a very wholesome moment, and really this is the point then where Ed drives his kids back home. I think Elizabeth is actually transported separately so that she is not in the media's eye. She's sort of taken out a back door, but she's returned home, and this is where she sort of has to try and acclimatize back to normal life. And I hope very much so, and I think at the time they did do this, they very much tried to shelter her from all of the publicity and the media, at least for the immediate time in which she managed to go home. But from that period on, I have to say she was front and center, national coverage. There were some less than ideal interviews that came out after where people were really trying to interrogate her and try and understand what happened. And I feel really overstepped a boundary. And she actually said that in some of the interviews. There's one in particular that we'll show now.
Did your kidnappers tell you they would hurt you or your family if you tried to get away?
You know, they did. And I really am here to support the bill and not to go into what, you know, what happened to me, what the whole, like, what is in my past, because I'm not here to give an interview on that. I'm here to help push this bill through.
You know, a lot of people have seen shots of you wearing a burqa. How did you see out of that thing?
You know, I'm really not going to talk about this at this time. I mean, that's something I just don't even look back at, and I really, to be frankly honest, I really don't appreciate you bringing all this up.
And as you can see, Elizabeth behaved so admirably there in the face of what must have been incredible pressure. And again, comes across as what we always knew her to be, a very intelligent, very charismatic young girl, even in the midst of all this trauma.
I'd really struggle to find anyone on earth that could be put through what Elizabeth Smart had been put through. And listen, I don't claim to know the woman. I'm not saying I know inside her mind, but to have done so well with herself and to be so such a role model for people to look up to, and you know, such an inspiration, and someone that took her pain and used it as a method to help so many people, thousands and thousands of people around the world. I don't think there's anyone that could have experienced what Elizabeth Smart did and find such positives from that experience.
100%. And I have to say, I've listened to various different interviews and podcasts with Elizabeth after the fact. And the one thing that I will remember throughout the entire thing is how amazingly erudite she actually is, and how she could talk about what was probably the worst moments of her entire life so eloquently.
One of the things that I definitely feel awful for Elizabeth Smart with, as well as what she had to endure, was the fact that her pain and her suffering didn't necessarily end once her captivity ended, because the people that needed being brought to justice and needed to take accountability for their actions weren't really forthcoming.
So what we've just described there is the amazing moment in which Ed actually sees his daughter again, and Elizabeth is now safe and well. What we haven't described is what happened to Brian and Wanda from the police stop. Obviously, they are then arrested, and you can imagine the police trying to interrogate them and try and find out what had actually happened. And the key thing is that they were very avoidant from this point. They didn't want to say anything, and in fact, when they did say things, they were often rambling, they were often incoherent, they were often leaning on their religious beliefs and not really answering any of the police's questions. Brian keeps going on and saying that Elizabeth was his daughter Augustine, and again diverting police from what actually had happened. He then went on to say that Elizabeth was actually his wife, that she was over 18 and that everything was completely normal, so much so that God had actually delivered this girl to him and that they were very much in love. And in her initial interviews, Wanda also reciprocated this point, saying that she was very much protecting her partner and that he was a prophet sent by God. And the police were so concerned with what the two were saying that they actually seconded them to a mental health facility, and they were placed under observation from that point. Wanda was initially deemed incompetent to stand trial in 2004. However, during a law change in 2006, which allowed forcible medication to be given to potentially mentally ill patients and prisoners, she was able to then stand trial. And in November 2009, Wanda actually reached a plea deal with the authorities, where she basically pled guilty to federal charges, including kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor across state lines, which meant in May 2010, Wanda was actually sentenced to 15 years in federal prison to run concurrently with a 15-year state sentence as well. As part of her plea deal, she also agreed, and this is key, to testify against Mitchell. But that's enough of Wanda. Now let's get back to Mitchell. Mitchell was initially found incompetent to stand trial in state court in 2005 and in 2006. And when he was in court, he repeatedly disrupted all of the court proceedings, singing hymns, shouting religious commands, and actually so much so that he was often removed from the courtroom. And in 2008, he was actually transferred to federal court, and he was subsequently allowed to stand trial. But this didn't happen until March 2010. Can you imagine? This is 7 years after Elizabeth was found. It is a crazy amount of time. Mitchell was charged federally with kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor across state lines with intent to engage in sexual activity. The trial began in November 2010, and the defense argued that Mitchell was not guilty by reason of insanity, claiming he had suffered from a delusional disorder and believed he was a prophet fulfilling a divine mission. Prosecutors argued that he was a master manipulator with antisocial and narcissistic personality disorders who used religion to justify his sexual desires and lifestyle. But on December the 10th, 2010, the jury rejected the insanity defense and found Mitchell guilty on both counts. And on May 25th, 2011, the US District Judge Dale Kimball sentenced Mitchell to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. So the question is then, Joey, what has happened since that point?
Well, believe it or not, quite a lot has happened since that point, and it's a combination of maybe things that people would have hoped would have happened, and then definitely things that people would have not wished to have happened. And I'll start off with Wanda Barzee, because I don't think that anyone at the time would have really wanted to see Wanda Barzee back out on the streets. I think they definitely would have been very concerned if Wanda Barzee had been released from prison by mistake, for example. But that's actually exactly what happened, because there was a miscalculation in the sentencing, and after serving 15 years behind bars, Wanda Barzee is released 5 years earlier than she was supposed to have been. Once she comes out of prison, the state contact all of her family members. They see whether anyone will house her, whether anyone will as much as offer her a sofa to crash on. But her family don't want to know her, unsurprisingly. No one wants anything to do with Wanda Barzee, and therefore the state have to house her. But they need to make sure they don't house her too close to a park or to a school, because in her release terms, it states very specifically that she cannot go near either of those. They actually have an amount of feet that she needs to be away from either parks or schools, and when the police house her, they decide to house her 2 rows from a school, just 100 feet further than it was said that she was allowed to come into contact with. And obviously local residents are furious about this. They're approaching Wanda Barzee in the street, and they are not doing it with any subtlety, in my opinion. They're letting Wanda Barzee know, you are not welcome here. Meanwhile, Wanda Barzee is still trying to talk to her family, and her daughter actually has to get a restraining order put out on her. And in April 2025, Wanda Barzee is rearrested for violating the terms of her parole after she was caught inside a park, surrounded by kids, by the way, the exact members of society that she contributed into basically fucking up the lives of, and she sat there feeding the ducks. Her reasoning, because in her words, the Lord had commanded her to go and feed the ducks. Now, one person who was very, very much disturbed to not only hear about this incident, but to also hear about the way that Wanda Barzee played it off, was Elizabeth Smart. You see, when Wanda Barzee said that the Lord had commended her, that brought back a lot of bad memories for Elizabeth Smart, because Wanda Barzee used to say that the Lord had commended her to do the things that she did to Elizabeth, which really does beg the question, had Wanda Barzee ever really truly been rehabilitated? And as for Brian David Mitchell, he will never be getting out of prison. Just how long he's in there for, though, is up to the imagination, because Brian David Mitchell has been the subject of persistent prison attacks. In May 2025, Brian David Mitchell was brutally attacked inside of a prison, being left in a pool of his own blood, and he was actually said to be furious with staff who he felt could have intervened but didn't. And he's actually then moved to a special confinement unit for his own safety. The problem is he's given a cellmate. The problem is his cellmate doesn't like Brian David Mitchell either, and therefore, after being moved as a result of getting beaten up, Brian David Mitchell is attacked again in prison, this time being beaten inside that cell, where other inmates claimed that they could hear him moaning and groaning for almost an hour. However, Brian David Mitchell refuses to report these attacks to the prison officers and the guards, saying that he believes it's divine intervention from the Lord. I would argue it's probably just other prisoners who don't like nonces and kidnappers, but each to their own.
And beyond those scumbags, which I don't think we need to talk about anymore, there were some lasting legacies off of the Elizabeth Smart kidnapping, including a lot of law changes in the United States. So much so that the case actually significantly bolstered child abduction response systems like the Amber Alert, which contributed ultimately to stronger child protection laws more generally. And it wasn't just that. Elizabeth Smart created her own foundation, which we will link in the description below if you want to look at it for yourself, which basically continues the work of the legislators and focuses on preventing sexual violence, empowering survivors, and changing cultural narratives around coercion and trauma, even in victims that say they're not under traumatic circumstances or in bad situations, that they're actually believed, listened to, and also sort of interrogated to make sure that they are actually safe. And that is what the foundation really works across. Again, we will link that in the description below. I am so interested to see what all of you guys thought of this case and also of the Netflix documentary, and let us know what you think of that documentary and how it actually told the story in the comments. And if you want to hear directly from Elizabeth Smart, why don't you check out the podcasts that our very good friend, and I would say the master of podcasting in the UK, actually did with True Geordie's actual podcast of Elizabeth Smart. He actually spoke to her directly. She was very erudite in that conversation. And Brian, as always, asked both the right questions, but did it incredibly sensitively, bearing in mind he was dealing with someone who had insane amount of trauma and also a lot of very bad experiences in speaking to people like that, trying to tell her own story.
Yeah, 100%. Definitely worth going and give that one a watch. And you'll obviously hear some first-hand accounts that we weren't able to bring you today. We have to thank our members because once again, and I would say like most of the videos that we're now putting out, this was of course a member's suggestion. I won't lie, I already knew about the case, of course, but I'm very, very glad we could get it out there for you guys. Thank you so much to all of our members who not only have suggested this video, but probably have suggested 9 out of 10 videos over the past couple of months. And if you want to put your own print on this channel, you can become a member yourself. There's a link in the description. It's less than a cup of coffee in London. And if you enjoyed today's video, I would highly recommend you watch the podcast that we did on a man named Ariel Castro, who was responsible for the Cleveland kidnappings. That's linked on screen right now. Thank you very much to everyone who made it round to the end of another video. We will see you all in the next one.